Hello, welcome to my tutorial on how to solve a Megaminx Blindfolded. This is the third one I've made. I'm doing this again because the previous two taught some techniques that I no longer think are good, and so I want to make one that shows some better methods to solving the Megaminx. Now I will say there are a few prerequisites for this video. You should be able to do at least a 3x3 blindfolded. I'd recommend multi-blind or 4x4 blind, but at least 3x3. And then you should be familiar with 3 style. You don't need to know how to do it, but you should be familiar with how it works. So let's get into it. There are 2 main parts of blind. There's memorization and execution. I would say that memorization is more difficult because it's more different from the standard 3x3, and it is what I've had the most issues with in the past. When you memorize a 3x3 or another cube, there are 24 stickers that you need to memo. So you can use a letter for each of those, and that's fine because there's 26 letters in the English alphabet. But a Megaminx has 60 stickers, and you don't have that many letters. So you need to figure out another way to do that. In the past, what I've done is apply 3 alphabets across the Megaminx, and then use a letter for each piece, and then some sort of encoded information to tell you which alphabet that is. So I started by doing colors, and then I didn't like that very much, so I switched to adjectives, and then I grew out of that and switched to letters to where I was using 1.5 letters per piece. And then I stopped for a few years, and I came back, and I started practicing again using the 1.5 letters per piece. And it went okay, but I realized I was pausing a lot when I was memorizing because I was processing that information, and then I was also pausing a lot during execution because I had to decode that information. And so I've decided I think the best method to memorizing it is using 2 letters per piece. The first letter being the color of the piece and the second being its position. And so here's a diagram of what that might look like. Each face has a letter which is based off the color. Some of them are a little creative to avoid repetition. And then A, B, C, D, and E show where on the face it is. I think this is the best system for someone who just wants to get one solve on a Megaminx, get their success and be done with it, because it uses letter pairs and that's it. And people are generally familiar with this from doing 3 blind. So I suggest using that. If you want to get fast, if you want to be doing a lot of solves on this, I would make a modification, because when you're doing 2 letters for each piece, that's 1 image per piece, which means that you only have 60 images, and that's going to get repetitive. Edges have 2 images on them, corners have 3 images on them, so each image is going to appear once every 1 or 2 solves. So to get around that, what I have done is use a system similar to PAO. Now PAO stands for Person, Action, Object. In this system, you make 1 large image out of 3 smaller images. So you have a person performing an action on or using an object. It's been used by some people to do blindfolded. I've tried it in the past. I don't recommend it. Don't use it for cubic blindfolded. Not very good. It's a lot more popular with speed cards, which is memorizing a deck of cards. And that's better because there's only 52 different possibilities, whereas with cubing, you need like 500. But on a Megaminx, when you only have 60 stickers, that's a pretty small number. The reason I modified it, though, is because with PAO, if you use that for a Megaminx, that would be 3 pieces for each PAO section. And 3 isn't very good, because if you're going for speed and you're doing something like this, you're going to want to use 3 style, and you're going to want to solve 2 pieces at a time. And it doesn't make sense to memorize 3 at a time, because that's not even. So I modified it to be PAAO, which is Person, Action, Adjective, Object. It's hard to come up with a large number of adjectives, which is why I wouldn't really use it for 3 blind, but when you only need 60, it's doable. You could use the letters to encode the person and the action and the adjective and the object to make recall fast. But I don't think that's a very good system because it doesn't let you be very creative with your adjectives and your actions. A better system, which is sort of what I've used, is to use the letters to encode your person and then have the adjective, action, object based on that person. So like if your letter is M-A, your person could be Mario and then jumping, red, Koopa shell. Next, let's talk about execution. So if you're going to be doing a lot of attempts, you want to get really fast, you should use 3 style. But I'm not going to go over that. Just take the method that I'm going over and modify it. I'm assuming someone who wants to be fast will already be familiar with 3 style and can figure that out. I'm going to talk about a method similar to 3 style, but it doesn't solve 2 pieces at a time, only 1. 3 style cycles 3 pieces. So instead of cycling the buffer and the 2 pieces you're trying to solve, this method cycles the buffer, a helper buffer, and the 1 piece you're trying to solve. When you're doing 3 style, you cycle 3 pieces at a time. So you'll have your buffer, and you'll have your first piece you're trying to solve and your second piece you're trying to solve. So whatever's in the buffer needs to go here. So you cycle it, and the first piece is solved. And then the piece that was in the first location goes to the second, and the second is solved. And then the piece that was in the second location goes to the buffer, and it's charged up for your next cycle. So now your next cycle, you take this, you put it in the first piece, that's solved, this is solved, and then you take that last one and put it in the buffer, save it for your next one. So you're solving 2 pieces at a time. Now, when you use a helper buffer, you solve 1 piece at a time, and it looks similar. So you have your buffer, you have your helper, and then you're trying to solve this piece. And the piece that needs to go here is in your buffer. So you cycle the buffer into that piece, and then this one gets cycled into the helper, and the helper goes down to the buffer. But now, when you're doing 3 style, this piece that you just got taken goes into the buffer, but now it's in the helper. So you do a cycle where you put the buffer into the piece goes up to the helper, and then the next time you reverse it, you put the helper into the piece, and the piece goes in the buffer. And then you put the buffer into the piece, and it goes to the helper, and then you put the helper in the piece, and it goes to the buffer. So you're going back and forth, back and forth. For odd targets, you need to put the piece into the helper. For even targets, you need to put the piece into the buffer. Let's look at this scramble. I use this as my buffer and this as my helper. So this goes here and then here. So first, on the odd target, I want to put the piece into the helper. So I would do my 3 cycle as interchange, insertion, reverse interchange, reverse insertion. And then the even, I want to put the piece into the buffer. So I would do insertion, interchange, reverse insertion, reverse interchange. And that's how I execute corners. So let's take a look at setup moves. So if a piece is on one of the faces that's adjacent to the U face, I want to get it here. So for example, if it's here, I'll first twist it into that position on its face and then do a D wide to get it here. Now that works if it's on the cream or the pink face, but if it's one of the other 3s, moving that face would disrupt one of the buffers, and I don't want to do that. So for example, if I was here, I could move it over to the cream, then adjust it, and move it back. If the piece is on the top face, one of these 3, what I'll do is move it off of the top and then deal with it as if it was one of these. So if I want to solve this, what I can do is bring it down, and conveniently it's already in the right spot, so I'll just move it over with a D wide and then it's ready to go. Now if it's on one of the 5 faces adjacent to the bottom, I want to get it here. So for example, if I wanted to solve this piece, I can adjust it over to that left side and then do a setup move to put it here. And now I can insert it doing an R prime, DR, R. Lastly, if it's on the bottom, I want to set it up here. So if I'm solving this piece, I'll do a dy2, so it's right there, and then I can do this insertion, r prime dr2 r. Now there's another thing to note about the helper buffer. So let's take a look at this scramble. The buffer goes here, and then that goes into the helper. So if I want to solve this, first I'll do this. So I set it up to this position, which just involves a dy, and it's already in the right position. And it's an odd target, so I put it directly into the helper, and then undo the setup. And now I don't need to do anything to execute the helper. I still want to memorize it, and it still counts as the even target, but I don't do anything to execute. The last thing to note about corner execution is twisted corners. And I solved this using a method you may be familiar with from 3x3, which is just using the sexy algorithm. So twisting corners would look something like this. Let's do a quick practice solve here. And for memo, I'm going to use that diagram that I showed earlier. So first, let's look at the buffer. This goes here, which is PD. So the person would be a panda. This goes here, which is SD. So if the person is Scooby-Doo, my action might be eating. Now, this goes here, which is WE. So if my person is Wally, my adjective might be robotic. And then that goes here, which is AB. So if my person is Abe Lincoln, my object might be a top hat. So my memorization would be a panda eating a robotic top hat. Now let's execute this. So this needs to go here, and that's adjacent to the bottom face. So I'll twist it until it's on the left, and then adjust it to this position. And then it's odd, so I insert it into the helper buffer. So I set up the helper, insert, undo the setup, undo the insert, and then undo those setup moves. Next was Scooby-Doo. So I'll move this over here so I can twist it freely, set it up there, and then move it back. And now it's ready. This is an even target, so I put it directly into the buffer, and then do my U move, undo, and undo the U. And then I move it back over here, undo that setup, and return it. Next was WE. So I'll set this up here, doing 2 large D moves, and then I do that insertion into the helper because it's odd. And then I undo those setups. And lastly, AB. So I'll move it off of the U face, adjust it down, and then bring it over here, and it's even, so directly into the buffer. Undo, move it up, and put it back on the top. And now we're done. Now let's go over edges. They are quite similar. I use this as my buffer, and this as my helper. And algorithms look something like this, where I'll be using this as the swap piece. So I'll do R, L prime, F prime, R prime, L to insert, and then I'll do a U2 for the U swap, undo the insert with R, L prime, F, R prime, L, and then undo that U move. And so all of the edge algorithms look something like that. How do I do setup moves? If a piece is on a face adjacent to the U face, I'll bring it over to the right and set it up here. So, for example, to do this one, I'll bring it over and then do an R prime to get it ready. And then I'll do the insertion like that. Now, you may encounter a case where the piece, for example, is right here and doing a dy doesn't move it. In that case, I would just put it in the right position first and then move it over. If a piece is on the U face, similarly to corners, I would just bring it down and then deal with it. So if we're wanting to solve this, I would just bring it down onto the pink and then pretend it's pink. And that would be my setup. If the piece is on one of the faces adjacent to the D face, I bring it over to this right face, which is currently purple, and then set it up here. So if I want to solve this red one, I bring red over into this right side position, and then I move this up here, and then the insertion looks like this. R, L prime, F2 prime, R prime, L, and then I do the U move, undo that insertion, undo the U move, undo my setups. Lastly, if a piece is on the D face, I bring it to this position, which is on the right side, which in my solved position is white and purple, and then I'll bring it up here, which, as you may recognize, is the same position I set up to if a piece is in one of these faces. So I bring it right there, and then I do that same style of algorithm. Just like corners, if you need to shoot to the buffer, don't do anything. If you need to shoot to the other side of the buffer, though, still don't do anything, and just memorize that it'll be flipped. That also applies to corners. Lastly is flipped edges. Now, there's an algorithm that you can use, but if you just want to get your one success, I'd recommend memorizing both sides of the piece. So here I would memorize this and execute it, and then I would execute the other side. So I'd have to do this setup, and it would be solved like that. Now let's do another quick example solve. I'm using the same memo here as I did with the corners. So let's start here. That goes here, which is PD, so that's a panda. That goes here, which is SD, Scooby-Doo, so that's eating. That goes here, which is WE, so Wally, that's robotic. And then this goes up here, which is not only the helper buffer, but it's also AB, Abe Lincoln, top hat. So panda, eating, robotic, top hat. So let's execute this. This is adjacent to the bottom face, so I want to set up on the right. It's already there, so I just need to twist it here. And then it's an odd target, so I want to put it into the helper. So I put the helper there, insert it, undo that move, and undo the insert, and then undo my setup. Next was Scooby-Doo. I want to get this on the right face, and it's already in the right position, and it's even, so I put it directly into the buffer. Next was robotic, so that's Wally. So I set it up here on that right side, do a DR2 prime to put it here, and then it's odd, so I want to put it into the helper. Undo my setups. And lastly, top hat is the helper buffer. And so you don't need to do anything to execute this, which you can see because it's already solved. Thank you for watching. I hope this helps you get a success on Megaminx Blindfolded, and I'm looking forward to some more people getting sub 10.